Hello, my name is Rob Shank, and for my language, power, and education concept presentation, I'll be focusing on Hawaiian Creole and language ideologies. To begin, a brief note on HC or Hawaiian Creole. Although Hawaiian Creole is colloquially referred to as a pidgin, there is a linguistic difference between a Creole and a pidgin. A pidgin is a language cobbled together from 3 to 4 languages in contact, as Lippy Green states. They arise in a restricted social context where people speaking 2 or more different languages must communicate for short amounts of time. Reduced and simplified, a pidgin is created out of need, basically. However, if children are born into a setting where a pidgin is actively used, they take in the raw data of pidgin and through language acquisition transform the pidgin into a fully functioning language, evolving the pidgin into a Creole according to Grimes, Marlowe and Giles, and Tiamira as cited by Lippy Green. Therefore, Hawaiian Pidgin is in fact a Creole and contains language elements from Hawaiian, Portuguese, Tagalog, Ilocano, Chinese, and Japanese, despite it being referred to as Hawaiian Pidgin on the island. So just making the point, even though it is colloquially referred to as Pidgin, during this presentation I'll be referring to Hawaiian Creole as HC or Hawaiian Creole. Now that we've established HC's origins, I want to investigate the concept of heritage language learners as coined by Valdez in 2001 and related to HC. Valdez defined a heritage language learner as a student who is raised in a home where a non English language is spoken, who speaks or understands that language, and who is to some degree bilingual in that language and English. Considering that HSP is spoken by around 600,000 people, according to Lippy Green, and that 100,000 to 200,000 of those people only speak Hawaiian Creole, it would make sense that some students in Hawaiian schools would be designated as heritage language learners, and thus taught in Hawaiian Creole. However, that is not the case. For many students, their heritage language is thought of as English by Hawaiian schools, thus creating a dichotomy between Hawaiian Creole and native English speakers that create rigid distinctions between academic languages, in this case English, and social languages, Hawaiian Creole. This distinction is clearly seen in school administration's attitudes towards students speaking Hawaiian Creole in class, despite Hawaiian Creole being used to express local identity and belonging, as described by Lum in his paper. This attempt to delegitimize HC enforces the rigid boundaries previously discussed and creates a deficit mindset regarding students who speak HC. These distinctions are defined by the sociolinguistic concept of diglossia, as discussed by Flores and Rosa, referencing Fishman. Diglossia refers to how language varieties are positioned as high or prestigious and low or as informal. Thus, speakers of HC are posited as speakers of low diglossic, with English seen as a high diglossic language. So, as you can see in the presentation, due to school attitudes and language ideologies that are formed around English and HC, English is perceived as having a high diglossic level, and Hawaiian Creole is posited as having a low diglossic level. This idea of English as the prestige language is rooted in ratio-linguistic and classist language ideologies, used to create new methods of difference that can then be used as tools of exclusion and denigration and oppression. Libby Green details this concept through the discussion of the media representation of HC, among others. This media representation that she mentions in her chapter shows Hawaiian Creole as a language of the disenfranchised, the poor, and the young. Positioning representing HC in this manner further enforces English as the reverse, i.e., the prestige language, and creates and enforces the concepts of difference previously described. Siegel, in his article, explains this concept in schools through teacher and researcher attitudes towards Hawaiian Creole. They cite it as a waste of time, not a real language, and a marker of permanent underclass status, among others. These attitudes were so dominant that from 1924 to the 1960s, speakers of Hawaiian Creole were physically separated from native English speakers in schools, using language to mask race and class discrimination as described by Ellis. Disregarding these claims against Hawaiian Creole, which are completely untrue and factually incorrect, in fact, as Hawaiian Creole is linguistically classified as a real language, the strength of Hawaiian Creole is present through its perceived difference to English, with writers such as Joe Balaz using Hawaiian Creole as cultural expression to challenge these ratio-linguistic ideologies. Through Balaz's use of Hawaiian Creole, he helps create a new voice or aesthetic that challenges monolinguistic premises and critiques colonial sovereignty, as Ellis explains in his article. Thus, Hawaiian Creole, rather than being considered a low language, is elevated to a high diglossic level through its use as artistic expression. And through HC's continued use, mainstream U.S. English is critiqued and deconstructed as colonial, thereby allowing Hawaiian Creole speakers to reclaim histories and linking Hawaiian Creole to the Hawaiian language and indigenous culture, practice, and resistance. This concept posits Hawaiian Creole as a tool to reclaim and define identity and sovereignty, and further legitimizes HC as a language. The sheer existence of native Hawaiian Creole speakers affirms this idea. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you listening to this, and have an excellent day.